Good. All righty. It's time.
Aren't you proud?
I know it. Good morning. How are y'all this morning? It's fine. I'll do it Tony Evans style with a handheld this morning. All right, it's good to see y'all. Do we have anybody we need to especially pray for this morning? Any needs that we need to mention? Yeah, Brother Randy's family. All righty. Any others?
There's a little boy Keegan's age, Hank Hardy. He broke his wrist yesterday in 2 places.
Okay. Jace. Have fun. All right. Any others? All right. If not, Brother Rick, will you open us this morning? Will you open us? Yeah.
Heavenly Father, thank you for this opportunity to gather in your house to complete the Lord in the day of forgiveness. You love and walk care over each other. Use this time, Lord, to learn more about the word and true saying. That we're all different, Lord, and you speak to each one of us differently. Lift up this time together, Sunday school, and worship time for each other. As you bring your message this morning, pray for all pastors, preachers, and teachers across our country and world, and expand the pulpit. That your word go out in truth, Lord. That lives will be touched, hearts will be changed. That there will be a drawing and a turning back to you for our nation. Lift up the sick, those mentioned this morning, and lost loved ones. And just thank you, Lord, for Jesus, for the cross, the blood that was shed for each of us, for the resurrection and his intercession, Lord, forgive us our sins. In Jesus' name, amen.
All right. Amen. We have made it to Revelation 9. I haven't tracked it to see how quick we're going to be done. I'm just giving up at this point. It'll just be what it is. But we're at Revelation 9. So last week we saw the first 4 of the trumpets. And without rehashing all the stuff that we said about the trumpets and all of that, what I think we need to keep in mind is we're coming up on these last 3, which the eagle has flown over and told us are these 3 great woes. And so that was kind of our textual clue that we're coming into kind of a different section with different expectations and so forth. So we have these woes that we're looking at. This morning we're going to look at the first one. So the way that this kind of breaks down is interesting because, and I'll say more about this at the end, but we have the first 2 woes, then we're going to have 2 interludes. So now with the 7 seals, we had 1 interlude. It was a pretty long interlude, but we had 1 interlude. Between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet, we've actually kind of got 2. But the way that John has set this up, and as I was going back and looking at it again this week, I've changed my mind about how we're going to approach this. I had said we were going to do the trumpets, and then we were going to do the bowls, and then we'd come back and get chapters 10 and 11. But John has set that up so that the interludes actually complement the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet. So instead of doing that, we're just going to take it straight through. So with that being said, we're going to look at the 5th trumpet, the 5th angel this morning. We're going to go ahead and read all of chapter 9, but then we'll just look at the first 12 verses. So let's look at Revelation 9. And the 5th angel blew his trumpet, and I saw a star fallen from heaven to earth, and he was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. He opened the shaft of the bottomless pit, and from the shaft rose smoke like the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened with the smoke from the shaft. Then from the smoke came locusts on the earth, and they were given power like the power of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were allowed to torment them for 5 months, but not to kill them, and their torment was like the torment of a scorpion when it stings someone. And in those days people will seek death and will not find it. They will long to die, but death will flee from them. In appearance, the locusts were like horses prepared for battle. On their heads were what looked like crowns of gold. Their faces were like human faces, their hair like women's hair, and their teeth like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. They have tails and stings like scorpions, and their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. They have as king over them the angel of the bottomless pit. His name in Hebrew is Abaddon, and in Greek he is called Apollyon. The first woe has passed. Behold, 2 woes are still to come. Then the 6th angel blew his trumpet, and I heard a voice from the 4 horns of the golden altar before God, saying to the 6th angel who had the trumpet, "Release the 4 angels who are bound at the great river Euphrates." So the 4 angels who had been prepared for the hour, the day, the month, and the year were released to kill 1/3 of mankind. The number of mounted troops was twice 10,000 times 10,000. I heard their number. And this is how I saw the horses in my vision and those who rode them. They wore breastplates the color of fire and sapphire and of sulfur, and the heads of the horses were like lions' heads, and fire and smoke and sulfur came out of their mouths. By these 3 plagues 1/3 of mankind was killed, by the fire and smoke and sulfur coming out of their mouths. For the power of the horses is in their mouths and in their tails, for their tails are like serpents with heads, and by means of them they wound. The rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands, nor give up worshiping demons and idols of gold and silver and bronze and stone and wood, which cannot see or hear or walk, nor did they repent of their murders or their sorceries or their sexual immoralities or their thefts. So we have these 2 visions, or 2 woes, these last 2 trumpets, and the reason that I wanted to read that whole chapter is because hopefully you heard similarities between them. As the judgments get more and more intense as Revelation goes, you begin to see the consistencies between them. I think one of the things that we like to do with Revelation is we like to look for the inconsistencies. What doesn't match up? What's the thing that confuses us the most? Where does the logic break down? And in some sense that works, and that brings us to a lot of good points, but in other ways, I think that confuses the matter. And so here, these last 2, or not these last 2, but this 5th and 6th trumpet, we'll start to see some similarities there. And then, as I said, when we get to the bowls, we'll look and see how they're tied in as well. So this first woe, given in these first 12 verses, is the height of apocalyptic imagery. If you have not been satisfied with what John has told you so far, well, here you go. And I say that because if I'm a movie director and I'm trying to put this on the screen somehow, even with all the CGI that we have and all of that kind of stuff, how in the world do you depict these locust soldier horse things? Right? They're sort of wild, and they're out here. I think really to show us and to remind us that even though John has been translated into heaven, and I can't stress this enough, he has been translated into heaven, and so he is getting this view, almost this divine view of human history from the beginning to the end. We've talked about all of that, but John is still a man. So even as he's getting this divine view, and even as he's getting the most consistent and the most comprehensive picture of God's justice and God's righteousness that he can, he's still having to put that into words and try to make it where we can understand it. And I think this begins to show us where language starts to fail us, because we can't see it. We're just here reading about it. So this whole scene gives us a really spectacular combination of images, because you have like this one main figure, and then it slowly morphs into something else, and then it morphs into something else. And so it's the same thing, but it kind of keeps changing. And this passage really is where the rubber meets the road for those of us who are visual readers, because how do we process this? So this narrative begins with a personified star opening the great pit, which is full of smoke like a hot furnace. Then when we get to verse 3, we have the appearance of locusts, which should bring to mind the 8th plague of Egypt. And at the same time, it also echoes the great locust plague of Joel 1 and 2. Now, you've heard me say before that in order to read Revelation, you need a really, really strong grasp of the Old Testament, particularly the Old Testament prophets. We probably should have spent more time in the Old Testament prophets before I tackled this, but there's a sense in which I don't know that you can know enough. But we have Exodus and Egypt going on. We have Joel 1 and 2, great locust plague going on, which Joel sees as the harbinger of the day of the Lord. That's the thing that Joel sees is kicking this whole deal off, okay? But what John has with these locusts is really interesting because he tells us they're locusts and then he describes them like scorpions. He says they have power like scorpions, they have the same ability to affect people like scorpions do, and by the way, they're also horses. You know, it's really bizarre. And it's unnatural. But it's not supposed to be. That's part of the project of apocalyptic literature. It is such a destruction, it is such an overturning of everything that we expect, everything we think we understand, that even what John sees and how he tells us he sees it sort of breaks down. So as we look at those first two verses, and I am going to take these in kind of chunks instead of individual verses, but as we look at these first two verses, we see that Revelation now takes a decidedly new turn in terms of its presentation of what John is seeing. Because up to this point, the various actors are living beings of some kind. I mean, even when we're in the throne room and we're seeing the four living creatures, as wild as they look, they are at least creatures. But as this fifth trumpet is blown, the major player is now a star fallen from heaven to earth. So all at once, it changes and the natural world begins to act almost human. Interestingly, the way that is phrased for us in the English and in the Greek, John does not see the star fall. He said it is one that has fallen at some point. But he tells us that this star was given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. Now again, I've said this to you before, I'll say it again. When you're reading Revelation, watch how that authority is handed off. It's not just that they have that power, whether it be the star here, whether it be the angels, whether it be the four that are holding back the winds at the four corners of the earth in chapter 7, they're given that power. Somebody has to say, go and take it. And here again, we have this sense in which God is the divine player, and he is doling out the power how he wants it to be distributed. So what we likely have here, some of you are already seeing this and you just wish I'd get on with it, but what we likely have here is a parody of what Gordon Fee, and I don't like this language, but it's the best I could do, what Gordon Fee calls the Satan legend. Luke chapter 10, verse 18, when Jesus is speaking about Satan, he talks about being there and seeing Satan fall like a star from heaven. I'm just going to pause there and riff on that for just a minute. What we know about Satan getting kicked out of heaven is primarily not from the Bible. There's very little that actually talks about that. I mean, I think maybe Jesus' comment is the only thing that we have. If you have this image of there being a great war in heaven between God and Satan, and then God getting fed up and kicking Satan out, and you have this idea of him like hurling down out of heaven to the earth, and then maybe down into the earth, depending on what that looks like for you. I hate to tell you, but that comes straight from John Milton, who was a 17th century English poet. That was Milton's riff on what happened. He was a minister and whatever like that. Wonderful poem, Paradise Lost. It's really, really long. It's good stuff, but that's not Bible. You can do with that what you want. That's free. It seems, though, that this idea of certainly Satan being kicked out of heaven, we know it to be true. His Jewish readers would have understood this. Probably his Gentile readers at this point would also have had some concept of this. So he's riffing on that. Maybe that is what he is seeing. Again, it's one of those areas. Is he just using common language? I don't know. In this particular moment, the angel is a non-malevolent angel who's going to set this next bit into motion. Now, I said in this moment because I don't think he stays that way. And we'll see why when we get further along. Because at the end, John's going to end the scene in verse 11 by naming Satan as the angel of the bottomless pit, who's also king of the scorpions, because we needed to be reminded of that too. So we should pay special attention to the way that the universe is structured in this. Because in this scene we have heaven, we have earth, and then we have this bottomless pit. This is a really old idea. It kind of fell out of favor for some reason around the Middle Ages, I think, whenever we had the scientific revolution. That sort of killed this idea. But there's this notion that there's a three-story universe, that you have heaven at the top, you have earth, and then you have, if you're Greek, the underworld, if you're Roman, Hades, if you're Jewish, Sheol, or some interesting place like that. If you're Christian, it's hell, right? So John is appealing to that. There's this three-story universe, and the bottomless pit is just below Earth's surface. I mean, the star has fallen, has landed on the earth, and is now going and opening, given the key, and he's opening the shaft, which is also particularly telling that there is access to earth both from below and above. And we need not ever forget that. So whatever we think the bottomless pit is, it is the domain of the demons. Whether or not we can say it's hell yet, everybody has their opinion about that. I have heard people who say hell hasn't been created yet. It doesn't come until the final judgment in chapter 19 and chapter 20. I have heard that it already exists. Do with that what you want. This is the domain of the demons. I'm going to leave it like that. I will say it's not their final domain, because in Revelation 20, they get thrown into the real hell, as I'll call it, the lake of fire and sulfur. And in verse 10, it says, where they will be tormented day and night forever. So the star opens the shaft of the bottomless pit. The smoke of this great furnace, then, just under the surface of the earth, starts boiling out when this thing has been opened. Again, this is another ancient idea of how the world works. You'll remember back when we looked at these previous trumpets, I said that the description of, let me see which one it is so I don't get it wrong, the first one actually, is a description of Mount Vesuvius erupting, or it would have felt that way. This is something that would have happened just 15 or 20 years before John was writing this. So that idea of there being like the surface level of dirt and then everything else being hot and like this furnace that's just kind of waiting to erupt would have already been in their mind. That's how they viewed the world. So when the pit is open to the earth, the smoke rises up out of it, and there's so much of it that the sun is darkened and the air is darkened. So to give you a really good, this is really helpful, give you an example of that. If you've seen the stuff coming out of Canada with all of the fires that they're having right now, and you've seen the pictures of the Northeast and D.C. and places like that where you just about can't see your hand in front of you. Think that, but worse. More intense. So in verse 3, we begin to see these echoes of the Exodus plagues. Because out of this smoke comes the locusts. And they're given power, like the power of scorpions of the earth. So here's where it breaks. It sounds a lot like Exodus, except what do the locusts do in the Exodus plague? They go after the crops. They go after the green stuff. What do the locusts do in the Revelation plague? They go after the people. Not to kill them, but to torment them and to torture them. But there's a group that doesn't get tormented and doesn't get tortured. And they are the ones who have God's seal on their foreheads. I just kind of want to go back and look at that for a minute. That's in verse 4. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree, but only those people who do not have the seal of God on their foreheads. All I will say to you about that is, why is that qualification put there if the church is not still here? Because we've already seen in chapter 7 who gets the seal: the great multitude, the sum total of the redeemed. I don't say that to scare you, because as the text tells us, they're protected from that. Remember, God's people are protected from his wrath. They are protected from his judgment. They're not necessarily protected from how people react to that, and we'll see that later in Revelation. But I also say that to say this: what are we as the church doing to prepare? Because just because we're protected from that doesn't mean we aren't scared when it's going on. Just because we're protected doesn't mean that we don't have a real faith crisis when that goes on. So what do we know about God? What do we know about who he is? I mean, if we spent time with that. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and we were having a really good conversation about all manner of things. She would just ask me a question, and then, as y'all know, I like to just run rabbits for a while, and we were talking about that, and she's got a little girl. And I told her, I said, the best thing you can do for that baby is teach her who God is. Teach her about his sovereignty, and about his infallibility, and about his omnipotence, and about his omnipresence. Because you cannot make sense of this for very long without a really, really consistent and comprehensive understanding of who God is. Otherwise, the Old Testament vengeful God, and the Revelation vengeful God, and the New Testament, barring Revelation, gracious and loving God, look like two different gods. But the minute that you have a good understanding and a good grasp, and you've sat with and wrestled with who God actually is, it begins to click, and it begins to come together. And Revelation does that for us if we'll let it. Because we see God's justice on display. But who's protected? His people. However you think about that protection. Brother Rick, we won't talk about the rapture. But however you think about that protection, whether we're here or whether we're not, God's people are protected. Okay, I'll get off my... Sorry, Kevin's got to preach. I'm not supposed to do that. So we want to be careful here, because John gives them, John doesn't give that to them. That's a bad note that I wrote. But John describes the power that they've been given. And they have the function of scorpions. They have the power of scorpions, but he does not say that they are scorpions. And you say, well, gee, why are you making such a big deal out of that? Well, let's look at verse 9, and we'll figure it out. So in very unlocust-like behavior, they're told not to harm the grass of the earth or any green plant or any tree. Instead, they act like scorpions and they harm the people. And to pick up a word from verse 5, they torment them. Some of your translations say they torture them. This is not pretty. So what's going on here, and I've said some of this a moment ago in verses 4 and 5, what's going on here is a throwback to chapter 7. We had the 144,000, the great multitude. We saw them sealed. So here it is in chapter 7. Do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Well, they've been sealed now, so the judgment can be unleashed. That's some really nice ambient music going. They are told now to harm those people who do not. So you go from chapter 7, don't do anything until we've sealed them, to, in effect, okay, they've been sealed, get after it. Go. Work on those people who don't have the seal on their foreheads. Because those who are servants are not subjected to God's wrath. But wrath and judgment are different. Notice in verse 5 that the judgment is not death. And I mean that in both the positive and the negative sense of that. The judgment is not death. And the judgment is not death. You can't die. You don't get out of this. They were allowed to torment them, verse 5 says, but not to kill them, and only for 5 months. So there's this temporal element, which you're going to find different interpretations of. It's really funny to me how hard people work to make the timeline and the symbolism of time in Revelation mean something. Sometimes it just doesn't. Sometimes it's just a symbol. And I think this is one of those cases. But I'll give you two, just in case you don't believe me or you don't like that one. 5 months is the length of a normal locust plague. In the ancient world, we have these stories in the Bible of these really intense locust plagues. That's not something that's unfamiliar to them, though. There were times when the locusts would come in and decimate crops, and they would have famines and so forth. 5 months is the typical length of that, give or take. It's my theory on that. It's a convenient, symbolic way of pointing to a short time. Now, why are we pointing to a short time? Because Satan's power is limited. God gives him the authority. God allows him to go open the shaft, to release the locust, demon, horse, scorpion things, but only for a time. God's still calling the shots. So even though the event itself is demonic, its timing and its length are under God's control. I don't know why, but this keeps coming back. This keeps circling back. Who is God? Is he powerful enough to not only control the events of heaven and not only control the events of earth, but also to control evil as well? He has to be. He has to be that powerful. If he's not that powerful, he's not God. Because if he can't control the powers of darkness, he's not all powerful. So he lets Satan have his day. He's letting Satan have his day now. We wouldn't be in the shape we were in if Satan wasn't having his day. But what does the Bible tell us about the church? The gates of hell shall not prevail against it. This is that same idea intensified. So in verse 6, John's readers would likely have been reading this. And you have to think about it. I've said it before. We're very privileged in the United States. We don't know what persecution looks like. We don't know what oppression looks like as the church. It doesn't matter if you're a snake handler in Appalachia or if you're a run-of-the-mill Baptist in Mississippi. Your religious freedom is protected. People might talk about you a little bit, whatever like that, but if you come against the church, we've seen it even in recent history, the full force of the justice system will come down on you even now. John's readers are being persecuted by the empire. It's a very different context. So they're reading this and they're hearing this, and what they're seeing is all those imperial powers, all those people who have been tasked by the empire with the job of persecuting and oppressing them are in this group that's now being tormented by the locusts. As my mama and my grandmama would say, you give as good as you get. You actually get worse in this case. So those who are currently tormenting God's people will have to endure the locust torture. Why? Because of what John says at the end of verse 6. They will seek death and they will not find it. And then he repeats, they will long to die, but death will flee from them. It is the one time, well, not the one time, but God is the author of life and death. Let's put it that way. He decides. And so we have it again. They're there, they're told me. This is, as I said, Revelation will do this work for us if we will let it. How do you read Job? You can go torment him. You can take everything he's got, right down to his children, his cattle, turn his wife against him, the whole 9 yards, but you cannot kill him. Now we're here. You have come against my people. you have tormented them. So you don't get to die. Because you need to understand. This is punishment. This is like, I'm glad parenting books don't rely on revelation for the sake of most children. But death is not a way out in this. When we get to verses 7 to 10, we get out of some of this heavy stuff and go into different heavy territory. We get this ninefold description of the locusts. Again, this whole scene is at the top of John's apocalyptic imagination. This is going to be in league with the woman and the beast and the woman clothed in the sun and all of that stuff that we're going to see coming up next. So as he's doing this, he's simultaneously trying to keep his imagery alive while also trying to depict an enormous cavalry of human soldiers. Now you said, wait a minute, I thought they were locusts and then I thought they were scorpions. Yes, now they're human soldiers. So it really almost becomes impossible to form a mental image of these soldiers. But what John is doing, Revelation should give you moments to laugh. And if you had been an early Christian reading this, you'd have probably laughed at this point. He's calling Rome out on one of their biggest fears, which is the barbarian hordes. We get that word barbarian because as Rome began to, Greece and then Rome kind of began to take over and their empire began to grow. When they got to Europe, the language that people were speaking there, they said it just sounded like they were going bar, 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 bar. So the word became barbarian. The only problem is the barbarians were tough, militarily speaking, and they were afraid of them. That's why if you go and you look and you're really into this kind of stuff, you see where the military outposts are and where the concentrated areas are. It's going to be on the European side of the empire, in large measure. So they're afraid of those people up there. And the description that John gives us of these locust horse scorpion soldiers is very much like a European barbarian. So let's look at it. They look like horses prepared for battle. Now, he's back in Joel chapter 2. Chapter 2, verse 4. I'm not going to read it, but I'll let you look at it later. So they were scorpion, or they're horses. Try again. They're locusts with the power of scorpions. Now they have become horses prepared for battle. And we get these 8 following features lined out for us. This is intended to excite his readers. This is intended to show them that God, I'm running a bunch of rabbits this morning. I hope y'all don't mind. How many times in Israel's history did God use the enemies of the nation to chastise them? How many times did he send them to exile with Assyria, with Babylon, with Rome? Now the tables are turned. And there's a sense in which John says that stuff that happened is being not undone, but it is being reversed so that now these barbarians whom Rome is really afraid of are coming in. Now, I'm not saying it's literally those barbarians. I'm saying it's who they look like. But they're far more powerful than that. So it's intended to excite the readers there. We move from this kind of normal imagery to this bizarre imagery and then back to something sort of normal for Revelation. So the first 2 are the most obvious references to those barbarians in the north. It says they have what look like crowns of gold on their head. Now, some people have said this is a legitimate crown, that these are kings of some sort. No, they're blonde-headed. Don't mess with blonde-headed people. Okay, fine. You'll get it later. That's an alien, okay, we laugh about that. That's an alien idea in the Mediterranean and the ancient Near East. These people are not blonde-headed. They're dark-complected, they're dark-headed, they're dark-eyed. It's just, that's the way it goes. So these Northern European folks with their blonde hair are real weird looking. So weird, this is free, but so weird that whenever Pope Gregory sent the missionaries to Europe to evangelize and Christianize that part of the world, he went himself. He goes over there and he says that they look like angels. And he called where he went Angleland, which became England. So that's so how weird it is that these people are blonde-headed. I mean, that's the idea that's going on. It's also why blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus is wrong, but anyway. And then he says their faces were like human faces. So we know now that he's trying to give us an image of this particular kind of person. Then he says their hair was like women's hair, it's long. Back to the barbarians, they have teeth like lions' teeth. They're tough. This is a combo military image. Also, they like to eat meat off the bone. They have breastplates like breastplates of iron. This is another combination image because on the one hand, don't forget, these started off as locusts. The underside of a locust is tough. So that's on the one side. On the other side, what is a real breastplate like? If it's doing its job, it's impenetrable. And then the noise of their wings was like the noise of many chariots with horses rushing into battle. He flipped on us. We were talking about the human side, but now he's back to the wings of the locusts. So we're moving between these two images. The wings of the locusts make this sound, but John is simultaneously depicting this army, which would sound like a horde of locusts coming in. So it's a lot of times, not always, you have to be careful, but a lot of times the image works backward and frontward. So the wings of the locusts sound like the horses and chariots. The horses and chariots sound like the wings of the locust. The only bad thing about using this is I can't turn my pages. And so finally in verse 10, he pulls back and he goes back to the image which kicked the whole thing off, to scorpions. But now we have a really bad mixing of metaphors. I say bad, it's not bad. Severe is a better word for it. So at the beginning, John has already said that the locusts have the power of scorpions. And now in this final clause of this description of the locusts, barbarians, whatever you want to call them, he returns to that scorpion image and he says, they have tails and stings like scorpions, and their power to hurt people for 5 months is in their tails. So he's come back around to say, this is limited. This power is kept in check by something. Here's a temporal element to it. And they're not all powerful. Their power is limited to one specific task, I think is a good way to understand that. I don't think that John's saying that so much to give hope. Because the eagle's already flown over and said, whoa, 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 to those who dwell on the earth. Meaning, you ought to be crying because this is not going to be fun for you. So now he says, John says, they've got power to hurt people for 5 months. It's limited to their tail. And if you're one dwelling on the earth, your question ought to be, oh God, what's next? And I think that's what John's saying. There's something worse headed your way. But wait, there's more. Verse 11. This seems almost unnecessary if you're just reading it. But John concludes this description of the fifth angel's trumpet by naming Satan as the king and the angel over the bottomless pit. So at this point, it becomes clear. I said that the star started out as a non-malevolent angel. He doesn't end that way. He becomes named. He is the commanding force behind this. He's not the driving force, he's not the controlling force, but Satan is the commanding force behind this. He's that star fallen from heaven to earth who is given the key to the shaft of the bottomless pit. But again, God is in control. That said, John gives Satan's full name both in Hebrew and in Greek. Abaddon and Apollyon. Now, if you're looking at the NIV, and y'all know I sometimes pick on the NIV, but if you're looking at the NIV very helpfully says for you, that is the destroyer, or some variation of that. It goes ahead and it translates that for you. I like that, so there it is for those of you who aren't using the NIV. Abaddon, destroyer. Apollyon, destroyer. That is who Satan is. That is the project for Satan, is to destroy. So John wants these people to know that even though they're going through persecution right now, and particularly and most often at the hands of the empire, he's equally concerned that the persecuted know that their persecutors are going to get theirs as well. You don't get to mess with God's people and not get your due. Full stop in the story. So, John uses this context of Joel's locust plague to signify a powerful army that will torture. Then he combines that with images hinting at the barbarian hordes which Rome is afraid of. And he melds that into a further picture that is ultimately demonic in character. And by doing that, John announces God's prior temporal judgments will come down on those who dwell on the earth. Now, I said prior there on purpose. These are not the final judgments. Even though they're coming against people, even though they're being judged for their rejection, even though they're being judged for their rebellion, they have not yet been judged. That doesn't come until chapters 19 and 20. So verse 12, this is one of those literary things that kind of makes me laugh, which y'all know that probably only funny to me, but the first woe has passed. Behold, 2 woes are still to come. It's like this interesting directive. Okay, we're done with that one, but wait, you got 2 more. But I think he actually does that to help us as we hear this and as we read it, because the 6th trumpet, which is also the second woe, is going to be a really complimentary picture of what we've just seen. And this note that we have in verse 12, we're going to see the same thing picked up in chapter 11, verse 14, to announce the end of the second woe. So I think John wants us to read these 2 woes and those 2 interludes in chapter 10 and chapter 11 as corresponding to each other in some way, so that the second woe is not over until the interludes are over. That's sort of different than what happens with the seals, because with the seals, you could almost take chapter 7 and put it anywhere, and it would be okay. It would make as much sense in any context as it does right there. These in chapter 10 and chapter 11 are a little bit different. Now, I'm going to go ahead and run some of you off by telling you that when we come to chapter 10 and chapter 11, the part of the way that I read Revelation is Revelation tells us the judgment that's happening on earth, and then it tells you what is happening to the church while that judgment is going on. So when we come to the 2 witnesses, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, you can prepare yourself for this. This is chapter 11. I do not think those are 2 literal people. And I know that's unpopular. I know most all of us want them to be Moses and Elijah. It does not say they are Moses and Elijah. It says they come in the power of Moses and Elijah. I think it's the church, but we'll unpack that when we get there. The reason I'm telling you that now is because I want you to read and think about, whether you agree with me or not, I want you to read and think about, as you're studying, what does the rest of chapter 9 look like? What does chapter 10 look like? Chapter 11, and that 7th trumpet. Because I think if you read all of that with the mindset that the church has a role in all of this, it actually makes that stuff more clear. In my reading. But you don't have to agree with that. I will defend it when we get there. All right, questions or comments? Kevin just gave me the look as though when we get to chapter 11, I will be voted out that night. I probably will. We'll see. All right, if not, let's have a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, thank you for this time we've had to come and study your word, Lord. As always, we thank you for it. We thank you for the miracle of it. Lord, I thank you for these people who are dedicated to the study of your word, who regularly come, and Lord, who bring their minds and their love to your word, Lord, so that they might better understand it. Lord, I thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak about it and to hopefully teach something, Lord, that you would work through me in spite of me and in spite of my own lack of understanding on some of these issues, Lord, but that you would bring clarity and inspiration in all of this. Lord, I pray for those that we mentioned this morning, those who are on our church prayer list. Lord, I thank you for Bible school this past week. I thank you for the children, and I thank you for the workers, Lord, and the good work that was done here through that, and the fun that we have and the love that grew because of it. And Lord, I just pray as we go into the second hour now that you would be with Kevin as he brings the message, and that you'd be with Miss Dot and Miss Dana and myself as we bring the music, that all of it would be for your honor and for your glory, Lord, and that all of us will leave from here knowing that we've come not to praise ourselves, but to praise you. And it's in Jesus' name that I pray. Amen. I can get a stand if you want it. I walk around too much, so I can't stand behind it. It is what it is. I didn't write it. You know what?